Welcome to Vietnam War and Peace. This is Unit 1, Vietnam's Early History, 1850 until 1945. And participants in this webinar can be expected to answer the essential questions pertaining to this unit at the conclusion of this webinar. Tyler, can you read these to us?
Sure. How did Vietnam's independence movement develop into the war with the United States? Why did the French dominate Indochina in the late 1800s? How could the Europeans justify conquering the native lands of the local people? Where else in the world did Westerners colonize native lands in the 1800s? What were the pros and cons of colonizing French Indochina? Why did the Vietnamese resist French imperialism? How did the French conquer Vietnam? Who organized the fight against the French? Who was Ho Chi Minh? Why did the United States support the French imperialists instead of the Vietnamese independence movement? Why did Ho Chi Minh become communist? Why was communism so threatening to Western powers? Why was Ho Chi Minh's declaration of independence controversial? And why did Ho Chi Minh negotiate a power-sharing agreement with the French at the end of World War II?
Perfect. So in answering that first question, we're looking at the Vietnam War in terms of an independence movement. This is a nationalist effort and how it made that transition into a full-blown war with the United States. They actually refer to the Vietnam War as the American War. And understanding this, really you need to turn to geography. Vietnam's nearly 2,000-year history of war and imperialism by China created a cultural spirit of independence against outsiders. Vietnam is an elongated state bordered by the Chinese, Cambodians, and Laotians, and its nearly 1,000-mile length opens to the Pacific Ocean, includes hundreds of small islands. This culture is very proud. They've led a tradition of resistance to invasion, and this caused internal fragmentation and civil wars. Notice the sequent occupancy of foreign invasions in Vietnam. So we have this philosophical resistance to outsiders based on Chinese dominating them for nearly a century, nearly 1,000 years, the French for nearly a century, the Japanese for a year, and then of course the Americans, 1954 by proxy, with advisors and secret operations, and then until 1973 when we withdrew. You'll see in Vietnam when you visit, there's monuments to the Trunk Sisters. This is a symbol of national heroism. It also represents the role of women in the nation's fight against outsiders. Notice also here that you have several distinct regions of Vietnam, right? And so centuries of constant warfare against Chinese created this internal fragmentation in a country prone to regional rivalries. Civil wars made it easier for the arriving French to dominate Southeast Asia, beginning roughly 1850. And although the natives resisted for over 20 years, the French succeeded in dividing Vietnam to 3 colonial regions. You have Cochin China, Annam, and of course Tonkin. The French declared Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia French Indochina officially in 1885. So essential question, why did the French dominate Indochina late 1800s? This is due to dynamics on the European mainland significantly. Competition amongst European powers and this theory of social Darwinism during the age of imperialism encouraged colonial enterprise in native countries throughout Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. The French expected profit from Vietnamese rubber plantations, and influential politicians justified conquest of Vietnam as part of the, quote, white man's burden to, quote, civilize the local people. And you see here rubber manufacturing taking place under some supervision of the French colonials. The Europeans justified conquering native lands of local people based on several theories. Right, there was some racism, that indigenous people were inferior, needed European white influence in order to advance. Prime Minister Jules Ferry expressed this idea publicly. Would you read this to us, Tyler?
The quote?
The quote
Yes.
from Jules Ferry.
Okay. Jules Ferry said, "Gentlemen, we must speak more loudly and more honestly. We must say openly that indeed the higher races have a right over the lower races. I repeat that that the superior races have a right because they have a duty. They have the duty to civilize the inferior races.
Yes, and this is a primary document which is part of this unit should you wish to treat yourself to more of his interesting pontifications. Notice also the political cartoons here that position this as a noble quest, right? This is very much a global phenomenon. And here this political cartoon shows the American eagle, right, from Philippines and Puerto Rico here, and these are a few examples of imperial era colonialism. It was a competition amongst the big world players to acquire other lands. Again, you have a political cartoon here. Notice you have the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba represented by dark children in the front row. You have the Chinese excluded at the door here, an African American washing windows, a Native American reading upside down book, and the white folks in the back. The contents of this piece here in the back on this bulletin board, Blackboard lessons, could be read here. And essentially, this is satire criticizing Uncle Sam's sentiments as they are expressed in Jules Ferry's previous quote. And basically he says here, school begins, Uncle Sam to his new class in civilization. Now, children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not. But just take a look at the class ahead of you, these here. And remember that in a little while you will feel as glad to be here as they are. Right? So this is a concept called consent of the governed, which is an interesting political science concept I'll leave you to investigate on your own. But realize that the Vietnamese didn't ask to be colonized, right? When the French showed up, there were benefits for the local people, right? But financially, Indochina proved to be something of a failure for the French government. Even though they invested railroads, medicine, infrastructure, and education, really there was more of the benefit went to big corporations rather than the local people. Michelin tires made great fortunes on rubber plantations. Vietnamese gained Western technologies, education, protection from the Chinese, but it was at a cost to their autonomy. So they resisted immediately. Why? Well, the French acted as elitists in Southeast Asia. French law replaced Vietnamese law. French became official language of Vietnam. Buddhist pagodas were destroyed and made way for Catholic churches. Vietnamese landlords lost their ancestral lands and were forced to work on French plantations. Furthermore, there's a divide and conquer approach to the magisterial governance of Vietnam. So you have the French putting these landlords in charge of Vietnamese local landlords in charge of their subordinate Vietnamese workers, and these are sort of puppet magistrates, if you will. And the Vietnamese elite who worked closely with the French received special treatment, benefited substantially, and then the working class people were stripped of their rights, given second-class status. Unlike the Laotians and the Cambodians didn't resist the French so much, but the Vietnamese continuously resisted this French imperialism, and often with tragic results. Obviously, graphic photo here. You have the French imprisoning Vietnamese resistors. They ruled with a very public iron fist, believing that this ruthless demonstration of violence would secure their power. You've got guillotine results here and bamboo stalks, which, of course, inspired the fight against the French. The Vietnamese elite and the rebels are French educated with ideals of liberté, fraternité, égalité, right? These are French notions, and the resistance fighters took them seriously. So these Enlightenment ideals of sovereignty were applied universally. Notice you have women fighting. There's a woman here and there's a woman here who are fighting alongside men. This is in the Viet Minh, the League of Struggle for Independence of Vietnam. This is a precursor to what would later become called the NVA and then the Viet Cong, guerrilla units and official North Vietnamese units who blended together and resisted the American presence. Viet Minh gained momentum under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh In Vietnam, he is referred to as Uncle Ho. He's born the son of an imperial magistrate. His national hero enjoyed a French education, so he had these notions of sovereignty and these ideals of egalitarianism. He actually worked in the United States during World War I. He studied abroad in Paris, 1917. And then following these Western ideals of freedom, Ho Chi Minh agitated for Vietnamese independence. He petitioned the world powers through diplomatic channels at the Treaty of Versailles, right? After World War I, at the Versailles peace talks, Ho Chi Minh asked the capitalist West for recognition of Vietnamese civil rights. He, of course, was denied admission to the Palace of Versailles talks. He even approached Woodrow Wilson for help in replacing French rule with a new nationalist government, but he was ignored. Western officials chose not to challenge the colonial claims of their allies. This is particularly ironic given the United States sentiments, right? Our ideals of freedom and democracy, of self-actualization, autonomy, independence, right? These are things that we hold dear as our values. Understanding why we chose to support the French instead of the Vietnamese is very important. Some regard this as a missed opportunity for peace. So we have here geopolitical concerns, right? You've got this foreign investment that is soaring in Vietnamese coal, rubber, and rice industries. A lot of foreigners wanted to recover their initial investments. It wasn't terribly profitable up until World War I, and the idea was, okay, well, perhaps if we hang on a little longer, then we can recover our investments. A thriving Indochina was seen as essential to revitalizing devastated French after World War I, right? The prospects were, they were hopeful. The idea was that the colonies will, of course, generate some revenue. The actual balance sheets on how much revenue they were generating and for whom is a question of dispute, right? I don't know that that was ever given real transparent analysis. But on top of that, you have this tradition of, these kind of elder statesmen coming together, making grand determinations for the world, right? You don't see people of color represented here. So it's not like this posturing on determining the fate of the world following World War I, the indigenous peoples were given a seat at that table. Finally, you've got post-war prosperity reduces the influences of this Viet Minh. It was this, and you have, this is within Vietnam, so you have a wealthy elite class that really liked the French being there. They didn't want the French to leave. They didn't want the Viet Minh to take over. So this is a fascinating study in internal stratification, right? You see there's Vietnamese here who are holding court over, in this political cartoon, right, are holding court over the natives. And when you have a stratification and a misalignment like that, you're not going to get unity within the country. Ho Chi Minh is a key person here. So enough talking, listening to my voice. I'm going to have Tyler take over here and read a little bit about Ho Chi Minh's biography. Why, Tyler, did Ho Chi Minh become a communist?
Well, upon rejection by the Western powers, Ho Chi Minh turned to communist Russia and China to help the Vietnamese nationalist cause. He founded the Vietnamese Communist Party in 1920, and between 1923 and 1938, he trained as a communist leader in Moscow and China. U.S. authorities claimed that Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist first and a communist second. He returned to Hanoi to lead the Viet Minh and declare Vietnam's independence from French rule in 1941.
Excellent. So Ho Chi Minh pursued Vietnam's independence with inspiration because of Western proclamations, right? The Atlantic Charter, 1941, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, they pledged to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. That includes Vietnam. In reality, neither country was serious about giving independence to their colonies around the world, and secretly it is said that Winston Churchill resented Roosevelt's meddling, that this was a thinly veiled attempt to get the British to relinquish India, given the movement under Mahatma Gandhi that was gaining momentum at the time. But bottom line is they weren't serious. So Ho Chi Minh positioned himself as an ally with the United States. He again requested support of the Americans during the early 1940s, and he got it, right? The U.S. Office of Strategic Services partnered with a precursor to the CIA. They partnered with Ho Chi Minh to successfully defeat the Japanese who were occupying Vietnam at the height of World War II. So at their last dinner, this is great fun, U.S. Major Allison Thomas, right, this guy here in the middle, asked Ho directly, was he a communist? And Ho Chi Minh replied, yes, but we can still be friends, can't we? Well, history has answered that question as an emphatic no. We cannot be friends, because this initial partnership, right, you see the Americans alongside in uniform with the Vietnamese, you've got these Vietnamese leadership and the major leadership of the operations here posing together as friends. And don't forget, of course, General Giap, who was the huge hero of the entire resistance movement against the French and then later the Americans. They were friends first, and it didn't last. Why? Okay, well, communism was very threatening to Western powers, and this is during the Cold War, right? Communism, and we need a moment here because this is very important for students of the Vietnam War to understand. Communism is the declared enemy of capitalism, and that is the economic system upon which the United States, and in fact most of the world, is built. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels professed that capitalism exploits ordinary workers and serves only to enrich the elite, right? And it declares that laborers must engage in a class struggle to take over the means of production, right? All the resources, all the land, all the distribution channels, and destroy the capitalist system. So in this way, theoretically, everyone will be equal. You've got from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, and by he we mean you two women, and that should be assumed. Communism ideal was used by totalitarian regimes of the Soviet Union and China. It masked efforts to consolidate state power, meaning to keep power of the governance of a country really isolated in the hands of a few dictators, deny basic human rights, and justify widespread violence against the people, right? So you have this theory of imagine all the people, right? Everyone's equal, there's no property. But in reality, a lot of these regimes that professed to be communist were pretty brutal against their people. So the spread of communism posed this threat to corporations, landowners, people in power. And since the central idea of communism was that everything is owned in common, right? All the people are going to own everything in common. Forgive me here. Well, what you have is a very threatening force on the horizon to everything you've ever worked for. All your wealth, all your property, all your holdings, all your territory, all your factories, everything that you have is going to be acquired by the state, and you will lose it. Well, this is no good. So Vietnam's independence struggle, right? It's being interpreted, gradually being interpreted as another arm of communism. Meanwhile, major events of World War II, you've got France falling to Nazi Germany, you've got the Japanese invading, occupying Vietnam, you've got the Viet Minh collaborating, as you saw previously, with the U.S. and Allied forces, and then you have atomic bombs dropped, and you have a conclusion that comes down here. This is an auspicious day. I think this is a good moment to take a break, and we will transition to the reading of Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence. How are we doing, Tyler?
Doing fine.
So do we, at this point, do I need to give you a minute?